Hello, I'm Garry Stevens, and welcome to the History in the Bible podcast. All the history, in all the books, in all the Bibles. Episode 113, Egypt Ho. In the last episode, we left Joseph with a solid job in the Egyptian government. As happened in the time of both Abraham and Isaac, famine strikes Jacob's family in Canaan. This seems to be an every-generation climate event. Jacob dispatches all his sons, save the youngest, Benjamin, to buy food from the prudent Egyptians. The brothers do not recognize Joseph, possibly because 20 years have elapsed, and because he is wearing the heavy makeup that all Egyptian officials wear in the movies. Joseph accuses them of espionage, but still provides them with grain, on condition that they leave Simeon as a hostage and later return with the youngest brother as a further hostage. While Jacob initially refuses to let Benjamin go to Egypt, further famine requires the brothers to undertake a second mission to the land of plenty, and they can only do that with the youngest son. Joseph receives them hospitably, and again sends them back to Canaan. This time he frames them by placing a silver goblet in Benjamin's bag. He is testing them. Will the brothers forsake Benjamin as they did him, or will they defend Benjamin as they did their sister Dinah? Benjamin, of course, is caught with the goblet. When Judah offers to take the place of his little brother, Joseph finally reveals his true identity. In an act of magnanimity unusual in Genesis, Joseph forgives his brothers and invites the whole family to take refuge in Egypt. Pharaoh thinks this is a grand idea, allocating to the Hebrews the best land in Egypt. Throughout the entire story, God is conspicuous by his absence. God sends dreams to Joseph, but never says a word directly to him. Genesis reminds us many times that God is supporting Joseph, but he only appears as a comforter in the background, an offstage supporter. The only time that God appears in person is when he reassures his father Jacob, not Joseph himself, that his family will be safe in Egypt. God forgets to mention the whole enslavement thing to come. Unlike his brothers, Joseph is always presented in a good light, save for being an aggravating, entitled, spoiled brat. Through years of imprisonment, he bears his misfortunes lightly, trusting in God to see him through. He forgives his brothers completely. After his family take up residence in Egypt, Joseph's story takes on a much darker tone. Long quote. Genesis 47:13. Now there was no bread in all the world, for the famine was very severe. Joseph gathered in all the money that was to be found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, as payment for the rations that were being procured. And Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's palace. All the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, "Give us bread, lest we die before your very eyes, for the money is gone." And Joseph said, "Bring your livestock, and I will sell to you against your livestock, if the money is gone." So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them bread in exchange for the horses, for the stocks of sheep and cattle, and the asses. And when that year was ended, they came to him the next year, and said to him, "We cannot hide from my lord that, with all the money and animal stocks consigned to my lord, nothing is left at my lord's disposal, save our persons and our farmland. Let us not perish before your eyes, both we and our land. Take us and our land in exchange for bread, and we with our land will be serfs to Pharaoh. Provide the seed that we may live and not die, and that the land may not become a waste." End quote. Joseph happily takes them up on their offer and appropriates all the farmland of Egypt. All the land passes to Pharaoh, except for that owned by the Hebrews and the Egyptian priests. There are two versions of the final stage of this calamitous process. Following the Masoretic text, the Jewish Study Bible says, quote, Genesis 47:21. And he removed the population town by town, from one end of Egypt's border to the other. End quote. The Hebrew in this passage is difficult even for scholars. When a Hebrew scholar says that a biblical passage is difficult, they invariably mean unintelligible. Jewish translators, who are committed to follow the Masoretic text, then scratch their heads at the gibberish and spend a few centuries arguing about what it all means. Christians have more tools in their translational arsenal. They go to other textual traditions. So the New American Bible and the New Revised Standard Version overcome the difficulty by following the Septuagint reading of the passage. Quote, Genesis 47:21. And the people were reduced to slavery, from one end of Egypt's territory to the other. End quote. The best that can be said is that Joseph conducted a Stalinist collectivization of agriculture. The worst that can be said is that he enslaved the rural workers of an entire nation, while his own ethnic group enjoyed a privileged landholder status. I've read a lot of apologetics about this account, all of which jump through hoops to depict Joseph as saving the Egyptians from themselves. I don't buy it, but then what do I know? The one speculation that no one is willing to voice, be they Christian or Jewish, is that the subsequent Hebrew servitude, as recounted in Exodus, was the Egyptian payback for their own bondage at the hands of the Hebrews. Genesis concludes with the deaths of Jacob and Joseph. Before they both go, Jacob adopts Joseph's sons Ephraim and Manasseh as his own, and blesses each of his own 12 sons. Jewish tradition holds that the grandsons Ephraim and Manasseh were blessed before their uncles because they were the first brothers in history who did not want to kill each other. That says a lot about the ancient Israelite worldview. But even here, Jacob is up to his old tricks. He intentionally gives the superior blessing to Joseph's younger son, Ephraim. Jacob's blessing, without the tricky bit, is traditionally bestowed on Jewish sons each Shabbat evening. Jacob continues by blessing his 12 sons. No doubt they reflect the status of the 12 tribes at the time that Genesis was compiled. Reuben is given short shrift. Quote, Genesis 49:3. Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might, and first fruit of my vigour, exceeding in rank and exceeding in honour. Unstable as water, you shall excel no longer. For when you mounted your father's bed, you brought disgrace. My couch he mounted. End quote. Judah gets the best rap. Quote, Genesis 49:8. You, O Judah, your brothers shall praise. Your hand shall be on the nape of your foes. Your father's sons shall bow low to you. Judah is a lion's whelp. On prey, my son, have you grown. He crouches, lies down like a lion. Like the king of beasts, who dare rouse him? The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, so that tribute shall come to him, and the homage of peoples be his. End quote. The other sons are summarily dealt with. And so ends Genesis and the stories of the patriarchs. The patriarchs are not critically important figures in Christianity. In the New Testament, Abraham pops up 90 times, most often in the letters. Jesus refers to him in the parable of the rich man and Lazarus in the Gospel of Luke. He is mentioned 24 times by Paul, several times by the author of the letter to the Hebrews, and in the martyr Stephen's speech to the Sanhedrin in Acts. Isaac rates only 17 mentions, most as simply Abraham's son. Jacob only gets 26, and invariably in the ancestral pedigree. Joseph's references are a scant handful. In their arguments with the Jews, early Christians were obliged to explain why people other than Jews merited God's favour. Genesis plainly said that circumcision was God's sign of the consecrated people. St. Paul argued that Abraham was justified or made righteous by his faith, not by being circumcised and by keeping the Torah. By stressing the importance of faith over circumcision, Paul concluded that it was not necessary for a man to be circumcised in order to be a child of Abraham. Paul also drew attention to the fact that Genesis states that all the nations are blessed through the patriarch, not just his living descendants. So all who share Abraham's faith will share in the promises that God made to him. In his letter to the Galatians, Paul made the tricky argument that the divine promises made to Abraham find their ultimate fulfillment in Jesus Christ. Quote, Galatians 3:15. Brothers, in human terms I say that no one can annul or amend even a human will once ratified. Now the promises were made to Abraham and to his descendant. It does not say, and to descendants, as referring to many, but as referring to one, and to your descendant, who is Christ. This is what I mean. The law, which came 430 years afterwards, does not annul a covenant previously ratified by God, so as to cancel the promise. For if the inheritance comes from the law, it is no longer from a promise, but God bestowed it on Abraham through a promise. End quote. To arrive at this conclusion, Paul focuses on the concept of Abraham's seed or offspring, mentioned several times in Genesis. In the Hebrew, this is a singular noun, taken to collectively refer to the children of Israel. Paul also treats it as a singular, but construes it as referring to a single person, Jesus. Now we come to the second book of the Bible, Exodus. In Judaism, it is called the book of Now These Are the Names, after its opening words. That is invariably abbreviated to Shemot, names. The traditional Christian title comes from the name used by Jews in the Hellenistic period, and also used in the Septuagint. Exodus Egyptu, departure from Egypt. Exodus tells how the Israelites broke free from their enslavement in Egypt in their attempt to reach Canaan, the land God promised them, under the leadership of Moses, Moshe, and his brother Aaron, Aharon. It narrates their journey into the wilderness in Sinai. There, the whole people encounter God, who bestows on them his rules for life, living, and worship, the covenant. This is the defining moment in Jewish history, the moment when God speaks to all Jews, present and future. The hero of the story, of course, is Moses, the first prophet of the Israelites and the utterly dominant figure in not only the Pentateuch, but the entire Old Testament. Only King David comes close, and that not by so much. In 4 entire books, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, Moses mediates between God and his people. God appears repeatedly to Moses in miraculous and frightening circumstances, leaving Moses to communicate God's will to the Israelites. Almost every element of Moses' early life foreshadows Israel's experience in Exodus. Rescue from death by royal decree, rescue from death by water, flight into the desert, meeting with God on the sacred mountain. In other traditions of the heroic, the focus is on the young hero's deeds. In the story of Moses, the emphasis is on what Moses shares with his people, not what makes him different. The book marks the transition from God's promises of progeny, land, and a permanent relationship with Israel to the fulfillment of those promises, beginning with the Israelites' phenomenal growth in Egypt, then the Exodus, and the covenant at Sinai. Most people think of Exodus as just telling the technicolor story of the escape from Egypt. But that is the least part of the book, 15 of its 40 chapters. The various movies based on the Exodus have presented the might and panoply of Egypt, the vast theatre of Pharaoh's court. In the book itself, almost nothing is said about the visual backdrop of the plague narratives. Egyptian culture is virtually unseen. The movies also linger long over the many sufferings of the Israelites, but Exodus spends just a few verses describing them. Exodus is much more than an escape story. A good case could be made that Exodus is the most important book in the whole Old Testament. Exodus, the book itself claims, recounts the first time that God revealed his personal name Yahweh to the Israelites. Exodus creates the entire framework of Israelite religion, priests and prophets, rituals and festivals. 2 of the 3 great pilgrimage festivals of Judaism are defined in Exodus: Passover, Pesach, which commemorates the escape from Egypt, and Shavuot, the Festival of Weeks, which marks the giving of the 10 Commandments. In Exodus, the Jews celebrate the weekly Sabbath for the first time. In Exodus, Moses becomes the first great prophet of Israel, and his brother Aaron the first great priest. In Exodus, we find the first law codes given to the Israelites. Not just the 10 Commandments, but a whole 3 chapters of laws. In Exodus, God also instructs the Israelites on how to establish their religion. He spends 14 chapters, almost a third of the book, describing how to assemble his holy abode and how to organize the priests who will serve him. As far as scholars can disentangle, Exodus is a complex interweaving of the J and P sources, with some passages from the E source thrown in. The crucial chapters, 19 to 24, that describe the foundation of the covenant and God's appearance to his people, are especially entwined. In the P source, Moses ascends Mount Sinai by himself to receive the instructions for building the abode of God, the tabernacle. In the E source, Moses ascends accompanied by Joshua, and the covenant is established by a blood rite. In the J source, Moses is followed by the priests and elders, and the covenant is established by a communal meal. Both Genesis and Exodus provide founding narratives for the Israelites. The Bible presents them as 2 complementary and successive chronicles. But if you look more closely, the 2 books tell 2 very different stories. The patriarchal stories of Genesis locate the origin of the Israelites in Mesopotamia. They describe how God promised Canaan to the patriarchs, and how Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob took possession of Canaan through peaceful real estate deals negotiated with the indigenous population. In the story of Genesis, the identity of the Israelites is constructed by elaborate genealogies from common ancestors. And the religion of the Israelites begins in Canaan, where Abraham and Jacob built slaughter sites to their God. God is most often called El, or some variant, El Shaddai, El Elyon, El Olam, El Roi, Everlasting God, God Most High, High God of Seeing. Many personal and place names incorporate the name El, Israel, Ishmael, Bethel. Exodus tells us a very different story. The theme of a land promised to ancestors is central to Genesis, but barely appears in Exodus. The patriarchs appear only 9 times in Exodus, and each time as an afterthought. Exodus 2:23 is typical. Quote, "A long time after that, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites were groaning under the bondage and cried out, and their cry for help from the bondage rose up to God. God heard their moaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. God looked upon the Israelites, and God took notice of them." End quote. If the book of Genesis had been lost to history, the removal of just 9 verses in the entire book of Exodus would have let Exodus stand alone as the story of Israel's origins. In Exodus, the Israelites originate in Egypt. They escape into the wilderness of Sinai, where they conclude a grand contract with God, accepted without reservation by the whole people on a holy mountain. The contract is consummated by a holy war of conquest against the indigenous Canaanites. The Israelites' identity is created not by kinship, but by the acceptance of a law code dictated by God. The Israelite religion is created in the purifying wilderness, away from both the idolaters in Egypt and the idolaters in Canaan. Exodus insists that the Israelites were a religious community that developed outside Canaan. And from Exodus on, when personal names include the name of God, it is not El that is used, but the root Yah or Yahu. Yehonatan, Jonathan. Yehoshua, Joshua. Yoshayahu, Josiah. The original Hebrew makes it much more clear than the English versions of these names. Exodus opens celebrating the success of the Israelites in Egypt after many years. They have multiplied so much that Pharaoh decides to control their numbers. According to the J source, they are subjected to forced labour. According to the peace source, they are entirely enslaved. Massed forced labour, unpaid work for the government, was common in ancient Egypt. Mass slavery was not. The slaves that did exist worked for the temples, in government administration, or as foreign contingents in the army. Their lot was usually somewhat better than the average peasant. Slaves were specifically exempted from the forced labour levies. The Israelites, says Exodus, are forced to work on new fortified cities, Pithom, Peratum, and Pi-Ramses, House of Ramses. The Septuagint adds a third city, On, which is Heliopolis. Python is identified, but Pi-Ramses and Heliopolis are firmly identified with locations in the eastern Nile Delta region near Sinai. What the Israelites did not build are the pyramids, already well over 1,000 years old at the time. Pharaoh concocts a plan to regulate Israelite numbers. Quote, Exodus 1:15. The king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrews' midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, saying, When you deliver the Hebrew women, look at the birth stool. If it is a boy, kill him. If it is a girl, let her live. The midwives, fearing God, did not do as the king of Egypt had told them. They let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, Why have you done this thing, letting the boys live? The midwives said to Pharaoh, Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women. They are vigorous. Before the midwife can come to them, they have given birth. And God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and increased greatly. End quote. The author of Exodus can give us the names of 2 midwives who appear precisely once in the entire Bible, but he cannot give us the name of the Pharaoh of the oppression. Moses escapes this attempted infanticide. Long quote. Exodus 2:1. A certain man of the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw how beautiful he was, she hid him for 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she got a wicker basket for him and corked it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child into it and placed it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. And his sister stationed herself at a distance to learn what would befall him. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe in the Nile. She spied the basket among the reeds. When she opened it, she saw that it was a child, a boy crying. She took pity on it and said, This must be a Hebrew child. Then the Levite's sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, Shall I go and get you a Hebrew nurse to suckle the child for you? And Pharaoh's daughter answered, Yes. So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, Take this child and nurse it for me. The child grew. She brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She called his name Moshe, he who pulls out. She said, For out of the water, more sure, I pulled him." End quote. The Hebrew word used for Moses' basket is tavor, which you could translate as ark. It is used in just 2 stories in the entire Bible, here and to describe the vessel that Noah escaped in. The Bible's etymology for Moses' name is pure fiction. Moses had an old-fashioned Egyptian name, shared with such pharaohs as Thutmose and Ramses. It means something like son of Tot, son of Ra. But the Israelites hearing the story would have appreciated the wordplay and irony. The Egyptian princess names the child because he is pulled out of the water. Later, Moses would pull out his people from both Egypt and the watery sea of reeds. Like Noah's Ark, the Ark of Moses was the instrument of salvation through perilous waters. This bears more than a passing resemblance to the birth story of Sargon the Great, the man who forged the world's first empire 1,000 years before Moses' time. His story was told and retold through the centuries. We have it from a late 7th century copy found at the library of the last great Assyrian king, Ashurbanipal. Quote, "Sargon, the mighty king, king of Agad am I. My mother was a changeling, my father I knew not. The brothers of my father loved the hills. My city is Azupiranu, which is situated on the banks of the Euphrates. My changeling mother conceived me, in secret she bore me. She set me in a basket of rushes, with bitumen she sealed my lid. She cast me into the river, which rose not over me. The river bore me up, and carried me to Archi, the drawer of water. Archi, the drawer of water, took me as his son, and reared me. Archi, the drawer of water, appointed me as his gardener." End quote. Neither the story of Moses' birth nor the attempted infanticide are mentioned again in the Old Testament. It is quite possible that these were late additions to the story of Moses. Exodus jumps to Moses' youth, telling us nothing of his childhood or education. Nowhere does it say that he was a prince of Egypt, nor that he was raised in Pharaoh's household. Moses kills an Egyptian who was beating a Hebrew. He hides the body and flees Egypt. This is not dignified behaviour. In another rapid-fire episode, he meets Reuel, a priest of Midian. Moses promptly marries his daughter Zipporah and has a son, Gershom. Midian seems to have been located in Arabia on the shores of the Gulf of Aqaba, which bounds the Sinai Peninsula to its east. As I mentioned in episode 1.5, this area may be the origin of the god Yahweh, whom the Hebrews would later adopt as their own. Moses is the greatest figure in the history of the Israelites, but he is a genealogical cipher. Much of the Pentateuch, the Torah, is devoted to describing lineages in unending, boring detail, justifying why this tribe got that piece of land, or why this tribe became sanctified priests. Yet Moses is an enigma. His parents are named in Exodus 6 as Amram and Amram's own aunt, Jochebed. Amram was a grandson of Levi, and Jochebed a daughter of Levi. The commentaries I have read praise Moses' double descent from Levi, but not a one pursues the consequences. For Moses was both his parents' son and their great-nephew. He was also his own cousin, or something like that. That's getting creepy. Moses' father-in-law is introduced as Reuel, but is later invariably called Jethro, Yitro. In Judges, Reuel is called Hovav, but in Numbers chapter 10, Hovav is named as Reuel's son, Moses' brother-in-law. Moses' wife Zipporah is mentioned by name only 3 times. The only other time Moses' wife is mentioned is in Numbers chapter 12. There, Moses' siblings, Aaron and Miriam, complain that he's married an unnamed Cushite woman. The Old Testament uses that term to describe black Africans. Zipporah, from northwestern Arabia, hardly fits that identification. Did Moses have 2 wives? We don't know. Moses' sons Gershom and Eliezer are virtually invisible. Gershom is mentioned just twice, and Eliezer just once. Then they disappear. The book of Numbers, chapter 3, talks of the generations of Aaron and Moses, and then ignores Moses' children completely, to list Aaron's descendants alone. In the next episode, Moses is commissioned to save his people. I'll see you next time on the History in the Bible podcast.